Hello and welcome to another episode of Trismegistus Minis. Today I'm going to be showing you the painting process for a base like this, both the cobblestone texture as well as the red marble. I'm going to be showing you how I painted the base on this little Watcher in the Dark using the same methods I did for the other one. If you haven't seen it already, check out part 1 of this video where I go over the process of making this base. I think that basing is something that really takes your models and elevates them to the next level. So, without further ado, let's jump into the painting process. Alright, so to kick things off, we're going to start by looking at the red marble. Let's take a look at the stock picture I used as a reference for this marble effect. Immediately, a few things stand out to me. First, and obviously, is all the veins in the marble itself. We have different shades of pink, red, some grays, blacks, and up to pure whites. In addition to that, we can also see how smooth the surface of the marble itself is. The top is reflecting a lot of light, the left side is pretty much in complete shadow, and the right side is more of a bounced or diffuse light. When approaching painting a colored marble, our goal is to capture all of these aspects and make them look convincing on the miniature. In order to do this, we need to think about two different aspects of the marble: the qualities of the material itself, and then how light is interplaying with that material. This process is mostly going to be broken down into two steps. First, we're going to paint the marble, the veins, and the base colors. Then after that, we're going to go in on top and paint in the lighting. This isn't the most simple way to do a marble effect. It's very similar in technique to something like non-metallic metal. So if you're looking for something more simple, I would suggest checking out dryer sheet methods for marble. That's very easy and can be done across a whole army pretty quickly. If you're looking to do something special for a character or unique model, then please give what I'm about to show you a shot. Okay, so to get started, here we have the Watcher in the Dark fully painted. As you can see, I've left the wet palette as it was as I painted that miniature. Now we're going to paint the Dark Angel symbol on the base with a red marble effect to match what I did on Azrael's base. This painting method will work for any color. I'll be using red, but you could easily do it with blue or green. First, I'm going to put down a little bit of Vallejo Heavy Red. This paint covers very well and has a nice muted red color, which will make a good base. You want to start off with a color that's a bit darker than your mid-tone, just so you have room to build up and add a little bit more visual interest to the veins and streaks going through the marble. In addition to that, I'm also putting down White Sands, which is a nice warm white tone from scale 75. For this first step, we just want to start off with a nice smooth layer of this red covering the entire symbol. Everything else we do from this point on will build on this layer, so it's important to make sure you have a good smooth foundation. I'm working in several thin coats here to get good coverage. Now, for the next step, we're going to start on drawing on the different veins on the marble. At this point, I'm making different mixes of white and heavy red in order to get different shades of pink, going from slightly pinkish red all the way up to pure white. From here, I'm just going to draw lines going in different directions and different patterns across the surface. At this point, it's important to think about how do you view this marble. For me, this symbol is all carved from one piece of the same marble, so I want my veins to carry across to different parts of it to keep the idea that it's all one piece of material that's being shaped. Using a brush with a sharp tip will help you keep your lines smooth and get good opacity on your first pass. In order to get a convincing effect, we also need to make sure that the thickness, opacity, and direction of our lines all seems fairly random. As we do this, I'll also start a darker mix using some petroleum gray from scale 75 with the heavy red from Vallejo, just to get some darker streaks going. It's important to note that this step is very much the ugly phase of this basing process. This is going to look like a bad Jackson Pollock painting for quite a while before we bring it all together to get the final marble effect. You can see that I'm working back and forth between the various mixes I have. I'm also going back to heavy red just to add more visual nuance and little details here and there. Once you're happy with the streaks and marbling, we'll go on to the next step. And now for the most difficult step. We are going to make the marble look shiny. Looking at the stock picture of marble, we can see that the brightest highlights are washing out a lot of the detail of the marble's internal texture. We are going to capture that by glazing brighter and darker colors on top of the surface that we just painted. To add to this effect, we also want to make sure that our light has a slightly different tone than the veins that we painted in. In order to do this, I'm going to make sure anything that is a highlight has some Tenier yellow from scale 75 mixed into it. This additional yellow hue will help to separate the internal texture of the marble from the light being reflected off of it. Here I'm going to start by mixing a little bit of the yellow color into my heavy red and make a pretty orange mixture that we'll use as our first set of glazes. Just as you would do with non-metallic metal or any highly reflective surface, we're going to start by picking out the areas where the light is brightest on the model. Then, working with very thin glazes, we're going to start covering a fairly broad area, building up to our brightest highlights. Because we are working with very light pigments in both the yellow and white, we want to make sure we're taking our time with this. Going too heavy too quickly runs the risk of overwhelming all of the texture work we did in the previous steps. These glazes will both bring together those textures as well as adding the surface interplay of light to make this look like it's actually marble. You can see that as I'm painting, all of the brush strokes are always moving in the direction of the brightest highlight. Once I'm happy with the first round of glazes, I'm going to mix in more yellow and then continue to pull towards the brightest highlight, but this time covering slightly less area. Because the symbol I'm working with here is flat, figuring out the placement of the highlights can be a little bit more difficult than on a symbol with a lot of details in the sculpt. If you're following a symbol that has more details sculpted onto it, you can just follow those raised and lowered edges and surfaces for your highlights and shadows. With something as flat as this, I would say pick a direction the light is coming from, and anything closer to that side, paint in your highlight color as I'm doing here, and anything further away should be cast into shadow. For me, I usually picture my light source as coming from my right hand, and so that gives me a good guide on where the light should be hitting. As I'm doing this, if I feel that the highlight color has gone a little bit too strong, I'll go back in with my heavy red and make another thin glaze and just push it back a little bit. It's very important that we continue to work in small steps as we do this to avoid drowning out that surface texture we worked on. Now I'm moving on to glazes of white with the yellow. You can see how little of the model we're painting with this. We really just want it to be a little specular highlight towards the tips and areas that are reflecting the most light. I'm not showing it in the video here, but I am keeping in mind that the watcher is going to be covering part of the symbol, and things like the hilt of the sword and parts of the wings won't be visible, and so I'm leaving those as mostly red or shadow tone. As I go, I'm adding in progressively more white into my highlights, but again, leaving it at a smaller and smaller area. Once we're relatively happy with the broad highlights, it's time to make it look very shiny by going in and doing edge highlighting. As with non-metallic metal or any other highly reflective surface, the edge highlight of pure white is what's going to help show how specular this material is. Even in the areas that are cast into shadow, we want to show that the edges are catching the light and bouncing it back to the viewer's eyes. It's important to remember that the light we're painting at this stage is not anything intrinsic to the marble itself. We already painted the marble's texture with the veins earlier in the process. What we're painting right now is the light as it's bounced off the surface of the marble into the viewer's eye. If you think about how real marble would work, as I change my position in relation to the marble, these highlights would also change. But because this is a fixed miniature and we're painting with non-reflective paints, we have to do our best to capture what the light would look like from a single angle. And for me, that is front on. And with the edge highlighting done, that is the finished marble on the base. If you were doing a larger surface or something with more sculpted details, mixing the red with the gray on the palette and then glazing that on to form your shadow tone would also be necessary. However, for the size of what we're working with here, just doing the mid-tone and highlights was enough. And here you can see the finished marble effect. It's not the easiest technique and definitely requires some understanding of lighting, but with a little bit of practice, you can get it going pretty quickly. I think for special models, it's definitely worth the extra effort. And now with the marble finished, we can start on the easy part, the rest of the stone. Here you can see that I've finished painting the Watcher, and on my wet palette, I have all of the paints I used on him. Now we're going to use those same paints, plus a few others, in the base itself. Doing this helps keep the whole mini looking uniform. It's easy to go overboard adding colors to a mini. The Watcher's paint scheme itself isn't very complicated. We have a single green for the ropes and boots, we have a beige for the robe, a red for the scabbard, and various yellows used on the non-metallic metal. We're going to use those, plus some of the reds we had from the marble, to create the base color. In addition to that, I'm adding two colors, blue-gray pale and pale gray blue, both from Vallejo. These are just going to act as a unifying mid-tone we can use to get the stone color. Here I'm going to start off by mixing in some of the green we have with the blue-gray pale. You can see that it's very, very little green, just enough to give it a very slight tint. And then working reasonably thin, we're going to paint that over the white to black pre-shade we already have on the model. This greenish blue-gray tone we just made is going to act as the highlight color. From the pre-shade, you can see that the most light is collecting on the viewer's right side of the base. Now, in order to make our shadow tone, I'm going to take some of the heavy red we used on the marble and mix that with the green. This is going to desaturate both colors and give us a dark gray. By varying the mix of how much red to green we have, we can change how the shadow color is going to read. In areas closer to the highlight, I'm going to work in more green, and in areas further away, more red. Because all of this is based off of colors we already have in the model, it's going to read as more cohesive. If you prefer wet blending to this kind of glazing, you absolutely can do that as well. I'm also going to take some of the petroleum gray we already had on the palette and use that to blackline the spaces between the stones. I'm making it fairly thin so the paint naturally flows into the gaps between. This blacklining step is really important for keeping the stones separate and really selling the effect that you have individual rocks on the base. We're going to continue going back and forth, adding in highlight colors and shadow colors to get the effect we're looking for. Here I'm looking at both the pre-shade and also the overall texture on the base itself to read where the highlights should go. Now, before we can go in and do our final round of highlights, we're going to do a thin wash with sepia ink. This is from Vallejo, but any similar product will work. We're going to thin this ink down quite a bit, and then just make a little glaze and run it over all of the stone. We want to be careful to go around the marble here, because any of this ink on that white will show a lot. What this will do is bring all of the highlight tones and shadow tones together, along with adding an earthy element to it that will make it read more as stone. If you happen to go too heavy on the wash here, that's totally fine. We can work it back in with more layers of the mid-tone in the next few steps. So now that we've finished glazing on the sepia ink, we are going to take our pale gray blue and mix that with some of our green to get our highlight tone. Using almost a stippling motion, we're going to look for the areas of rock that are raised more than others and start picking out our highlights. Remember to keep the facing of the light consistent with what you did on the marble. I haven't covered it in this series, but the lighting on the Watcher in the dark is also uniform with all of this. When we're working with any effect where we want to trick the eye into thinking something is shiny, having all of the lights read as coming from the same directions is very important. Your brain is very good at detecting when things look off, even if you don't really understand the reason why. And after just picking out a few more highlights, that's pretty much all there is to this base. The next step's very simple. I just took some black airbrush primer and used that to paint the rim of the base black. I like using primer for this step because it's relatively tough, goes on pretty smooth, and covers very well. And home stretch, we're just going to use a little bit of super glue to put our little watcher buddy in place. And that's the finished model. And there you have it. A decent amount of work for such a little guy, but I think you can't argue with the end result. Putting the extra time into your basing and putting some color theory into it really makes a big difference for how your army reads. I hope you found something in this interesting. If you learned something new, let me know in the comments below. This has been Trismegistus Minis. Thanks again for watching.